Good day, modelers, and welcome back to my workshop, where today we're going to be starting the build of the Junkers CL-1 by Seagull Models. Now, if you watched the unboxing video, you'll remember that when I got to the cowl, I was a little bit surprised because it showed a plane powered by a 4-cylinder horizontally opposed engine right here, whereas the original was powered by an inline 6-cylinder Mercedes-Benz engine, which you can see in the picture right here. Now, what I've learned is that this kit was modeled after a half-scale replica, not an actual CL-1, probably because they couldn't find one, if any even still exist. You'll also notice a couple other of small differences between the model and the original. Namely, the original has a much smaller vertical fin, about half the size, but also it is skinned in that famous Junkers corrugated aluminum. Now, let's get to the build, and as usual, we start with the wings.
Starting with either wing half, install the aileron to the wing using the included CA hinges in the pre-cut slots. Once everything is in place, use a few drops of thin CA on each hinge. Flip the wing half over and glue the other side of each hinge. Clean off any excess glue with alcohol and repeat all of the steps for the other wing half. After the glue has dried, mix up some epoxy and glue the very nice included fiberglass control horns into each wing half. Clean off any extra epoxy with alcohol and paper towels, make sure everything is straight, and let the epoxy cure. Grab a servo and slide it into place on one of the servo mounts, making sure to have centered the servo horn first. Drill holes for each of the mounting screws using a pin vise, and then thread each hole using a screw. Remember to harden the threads using a drop of thin CA in each hole before permanently mounting the servo. Attach a servo lead extension, secure it with heat shrink tubing, and fish the cable through the wing using the pre-installed strings. Once in place, attach the servo mount to the wing, making sure again to strengthen the threads with thin CA. Repeat all the steps for the other wing half. Now grab one of the included shorter push rods and attach it to the aileron. Mark where to bend the rod at the servo, remove it and put a 90-degree bend at the mark. Install a keeper on the rod and cut off the excess wire. Reinstall the push rod to the aileron, adjust its length until centered, and then add some blue Loctite and tighten the retaining nut using some pliers. Slide the other end through the servo horn and install the keeper. Make sure everything works and repeat for the other wing.
So with the wings done, we're going to move on to the fuselage. And the first thing I like to do is attach the tail surfaces. And we start by attaching the elevator to the horizontal stabilizer, just like we attach the ailerons to the wings.
Once the elevator hinges are glued, put a mark at the center of both the front and back of the horizontal stabilizer and slide it into place on the fuselage. The marks make it easy to make sure the stabilizer is centered on the fuselage. One thing missing in the manual for this plane was showing the steps for correctly aligning the horizontal stabilizer, so here is what you want to do. Mount the wings to the fuselage and measure from each wingtip to the corresponding stabilizer tip. Adjust the stabilizer until these measurements are equal. Then, mark the covering on the stabilizer where it meets the wing and remove it to ensure a good glue bond. Mount the stabilizer back in place, take a few steps back and look to see if the wings and horizontal stabilizer are parallel. If they aren't, like mine, Sand the slot where the stabilizer joins the fuselage a little at a time and recheck until the stab and wings are parallel. This is critical to having a good flying plane, so take your time. Once everything is set, mix up a good-sized batch of 30-minute epoxy and permanently mount the horizontal stabilizer, double checking all of your measurements before the epoxy cures, and let it fully set overnight. While the epoxy cures, you can attach the rudder to the vertical stab using CA hinges. Then, epoxy in the fiberglass control horns on the rudder and elevator. When everything is good and dry, mount the vertical stab and rudder to the fuselage using the same techniques as the horizontal stab. Once you have removed the covering and installed the vertical stab in place, clean up the excess epoxy and let everything set overnight. Now we can install servos for the elevator, rudder, and throttle in the fuselage. Once they are done, install push rods just like you did for the ailerons and give everything a test. Next, we can install the scale strengthening wires on the tail. These can be a little finicky, so take your time. They are a pain, but really do add a nice scale touch to the plane. Once you have the 4 wires crimped in place, finish off the tail by installing the tail wheel assembly.
Okay, so with the tail all done, the next thing we're going to want to do is to work on mounting the engine, which you can see the engine right there. And also, here are the engine mounts. I have them temporarily mounted to the front of the fuselage, and the engine is going to mount sideways, so it'll be like that. So the first thing we're going to do is temporarily place the engine in place, and then set the distance from the firewall, right there, to the thrust washer, which you can see right here, and get that all lined up.
Mount the engine at the distance in the manual. And then mark the center of the 4 mounting holes, drill each hole, and use a screw to pre-thread each one. This makes mounting the engine much easier. When the engine is mounted, you can bend and attach the throttle push rod and then cut and mount the cowl. Take your time and only remove as much fiberglass as needed. Now it's time to mount the main landing gear to the fuselage, making sure to use blue Loctite because these bolts love to come loose. Mount the main wheels, followed by a metal tab for the wing strengthening wires, and lastly a collar with Loctite and a set screw. This is a great time to glue on all the scale extras with a little help from the supervisor. Once she has approved your work, attach the 12 strengthening wires to both the top and bottom of each wing. The ones on the wing have a spring and bolt so you can easily remove them along with the wing for transport to the flying field.
So I'm putting the finishing touches on the Junkers CL-1, and I ran into a little problem I want to show you guys. You can see the fuel tank sticking up there, and I had to cut away a little bit of the cockpit floor. That's because they did not leave enough room to put foam rubber underneath the fuel tank. You can see it's sticking up right there, and you always want to put foam rubber underneath your fuel tank to isolate vibrations so that you don't make your fuel foam, which can cause air bubbles and make your engine quit mid-flight. You can also see the receiver battery is right up there, and then we've got the throttle servo and wire run. The receiver is all set with the antenna, so we're just about done. All I have to do is I'm going to just build a new floor, a little bit raised up in the bottom of the cockpit there, paint it black so you never know the difference, and we should be just about done. Alright, I just finished fixing the cockpit floor, and with that, the build of the Junkers CL-1 by Seagull model sold by Legend Hobby is done. But overall, I am really happy with how this plane turned out. Ran into only two small issues. One, obviously the fuel tank being a little bit too tall, and second, the instruction manual was a little bit lacking in both detail on how to install the strengthening wires and also making sure that the horizontal stabilizer was parallel with the wing before you mount it. But if you've built a couple of ARFs, you should have zero issues. Other than that, I gotta say, this kit is fantastic. The quality is top notch, and for the price, which is around $330, I highly recommend it, and I would buy it again, absolutely. So with that, this build is done, and the next step is to take this baby out and get it in the air. See you next time.